claim that one had gotten sick at work instead of somewhere else would have been hard to do, as large law firms surely recognized. Moreover, even if they could prove they had contracted COVID-19 at work, low-wage workers would have been the least likely to be awarded enough money to make it worthwhile for a lawyer to take the case. On their websites, however, law firms echoed senators' warnings and noted that even the threat of litigation was troubling. So did the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Making sense of the early advocacy for liability protection requires contextualizing it within a timeline of the politics of litigation that long predated the pandemic. Limiting liability for injury was a long-standing issue for conservative advocates. It condensed ideas about individual responsibility and morality, and the costs of doing business, that many years of advocacy had made resonant in the United States. This trend persisted in the pandemic. Congress could not enact limits to liability before the 2020 election, other than for healthcare workers, and since it was a Republican initiative, Democratic majorities in Congress, after the 2020 election, made protection from lawsuits at the national level less likely. Advocates for expanding limits to liability, therefore, turned to the states. The states were a familiar venue for advocates of conservative legislation, including limiting liability. The conservative advocacy group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, had been active on liability politics in state houses from the late 1980s onward, primarily by proposing model legislation. Their model had led to many successes over the years. Revisiting liability was therefore a matter of going over familiar ground. It did not require a real threat or answering explanations of why there was unlikely to be much of a threat. Situating the pandemic, governing a changing climate. Embedded in the risks the construction workers in Florida faced was a changing climate. They were tasked with building on lands subject to sea level rise from climate change. In addition, U.S. national security officials and consensus elite research reports have concluded that climate change contributes to the destabilization of countries from which people flee, including Guatemala. People who had fled Guatemala were now working in Florida and vulnerable to the virus's spread. These threads, climate change, climate migration, and the virus, cannot be disentangled. Sorting out connections, though, depends on a tolerance for extended timelines and processes that not everyone shares, but that is critical to understanding governance in a changing climate. Governing in a changing climate will continue to work through the same set of actors, institutions, and issues that were mobilized in the pandemic. Disagreeing about what even count as problems, liability, workers' and families' safety, and as we will see, public religious exercise, predated the pandemic and will persist after it. Contests over attribution, evidence, and priorities, such as economic activity and public health, open opportunities for actors to advocate in court because organizations that go to court or argue about liability in court had mobilized long before the pandemic. In the pandemic, courts heard contests about legal authority, especially concerning civil rights and the failures of insurance claims. If governors, legislatures, and interest organizations can repurpose issues for the pandemic, they will continue to repurpose them for other climate-related problems.